because of the greater promise it has to in terms of addressing the enduring problems and difficulties within the system, or the criminal justice system as a whole. In terms of talking about these issues, we'll begin just by reflecting on the issue of abolition, and you can see what you think about that. And then we'll talk a little bit about one of the most famous articles in criminology, and probably certainly the most famous article in the field of restorative justice, which is Mills Christie's article, Conflicts as Property. And that's really a segue to thinking about who owns conflicts, who has the right to be involved, and what should it actually mean in terms of the procedures put in place. And that, in effect, is the issue of restorative justice. So we'll talk a little bit about the principles behind it, we'll talk a little bit about the practice involved with it, and then we'll talk a little bit about issues and concerns. Just questions, really, regarding its use and its potential value. So to begin, just by talking about the issue of prison abolitions. And first of all, what is it? Well, it's a movement. And it's a movement, and so many things are really characterized by the words used to describe it. And its overall goal is to minimize prison use, or even eradicate prison use. So its overall goal would be the abolition of prisons. The abolition of prisons. You spend so much time building them, you put so much money and effort into putting an awful lot of people in them over the course of history, and now you're saying you want to abolish them. Couldn't you have told us that at the start? Well, the reason you couldn't is that the voices from which this movement arose are really quite recent. We see it in particular in prisoners' rights movements, and in particular Scandinavian prisoners' rights movements, where, as Mills Christie's notes, annually there would be a conference in Norway where prisoner representatives of the prison system, governors, prison guards, and then representatives of wider society, civil society representatives, political leaders, academics, people who've done research and so on, service providers, would come together to talk about imprisonment. But what it meant, of course, was that critical voices were really much more prominent there than in other cases. They also emerged from various, I suppose, charities or community groups or third sector organizations, which highlighted the specific problems of prison over and over and over. You had a group of radical criminologists, including people who had been to prison. There were people who perhaps first began to study criminology while they were inmates. So a genre, a framework of understanding prisons emerged from what became known as convict criminology. In other words, prisoners who wrote about prisons, offering, you might imagine, an interesting, if quite personal, perspective on it. But ultimately, if it emerged into a movement, it emerged because of a number of set issues. Concerns about the robustness, the efficiency, the effectiveness, the humaneness of the current system, and an effort to find better alternatives. You're spending all this money, the rate of recidivism is high, in other words, you send people to prison, and yet so many of them go back. There are concerns about the protection of people's inherent rights, their integrity of their person, their privacy, and so on. So, if we think of the prison system as a failure, as so many people did, one of the real questions is, and remember, Dickens was writing about the emergence of the prison system and its status as a failed system. So how could a system that so many people describe as failed continue? This is one of the puzzles, of course. But abolitionism is also a little bit wider than that. Not just prisons, but also the criminal law. Are we too reliant on the more punitive approaches reflected within the criminal law, the black and whiteness of it, making sharp distinctions between what are often quite nuanced and delicate and human issues? And so part and parcel of abolitionism is saying, do we use the criminal law and therefore the punishment of the criminal law, the prison system? Do we use that too much to deal with what might be problems, what might be human problems? So, for example, an awful lot of people who go to prison are illiterate. They cannot read. It's not simply that they haven't completed a good level of schooling, in other words, a lot of years. It's that they cannot read. One of the last prison service studies found 20% of people were illiterate, maybe 30% could only sign their names. Only sign their names. Doesn't that sound like something from a history book as opposed to something from the present day? So, if one issue is literacy and education, might there be an educational problem that should be dealt with through the educational system, but instead it ends up being a prison service problem, it ends up being a legal problem, it ends up being a problem that people address through greater recourse to punishment and imprisonment. Alcoholism, drug addiction. People with ADHD, people with short attention spans, quick tempers. Is that a psychological condition? Is it social circumstances? Whatever the origin of the issue, the concern, might it be dealt with in other ways? Many people who go to prison have serious addiction problems. Might they end up in prison because of an addiction problem? In other words, is the penal system dealing with something that we might be able to deal with in other ways? An awful lot of crime gets committed by people stealing, petty theft, burglaries, robberies, assaults. You know, a great nuisance for the people involved, but probably in the grand scheme of things, these are not the serial killers of our times. They're offenses, and often many offenses. First of all, that suggests that, gosh, you've committed so many offenses, and yet your involvement with the penal system hasn't solved the problem. So maybe the issue there is the penal system does not solve the problem. But also, so many offenses, might there be an issue of addiction that sending someone to prison is just an inappropriate approach to take? Will future generations look back and say, so many people in Ireland in the 20th century, the 21st century, were sent to prison? And it appears that many of their offending behaviors arose from addiction. What kind of barbaric society was Ireland, such that Ireland imprisoned people who had medical or social or psychological or personal problems or difficulties? And that's not to define them in a particular way. It's simply to say that maybe defining them as legal problems, requiring a legal solution, hence punishment, maybe that is the problematic issue. It's not to say people are saints. It's not to say that the problems would suddenly disappear if the prison system disappeared. It's simply to say, is this really a good solution for the problem at hand? So, we see Willem de Haan's description of abolitionism. And here's another approach. This is by Pat Carlin, a fairly brilliant criminologist. She was one of the first people who really wrote about female imprisonment in a very sustained and critical way. So she says, well, people are critical of abolitionism. You might say, gosh, you're going to abolish prisons? Nonsense. That'll never wash. Get real. So now we're trying to think of a way to put this into more practical terms. So this is what she suggests. I'll just give you a minute to read it. all ready? Okay, so I'm running for election in the next election. This is on my manifesto. I knock on your door. Helpfully, you're all gathered together in one place. And here's my manifesto. And I ask you to vote for me on the basis of advocating this particular policy. And your response is,
it depends on the area in which you were campaigning in the first place. How many people in that group were victims and repeated victims of whatever took the person into prison or person should be in prison.
so you think people who've been victimized
If
through
the
crime
victim-
would be more punitive?
Yeah.
They'd be less willing to hear that message.
Yeah.
That could be, yeah. Victimization isn't fun. We don't like when it happens to us. We want some kind of response.
I suppose it would depend on the case that was made. You know, evidence-based research that prison doesn't work. You know, if someone put across a good case that is beneficial for society.
Well, of course, obviously it depends on what would constitute success. And obviously, crimes are still committed in prison, but if you lock someone up for a particular period of time, what's certain is that during that time, they can't go out and physically assault someone in the wider world. So in that sense, you are preventing some certain amount of crime, likely crime, from happening. The question is that the best way of achieving that goal? And after all, remember, what do we know? Recidivism. You go to prison, what's the best indicator of going to prison? Have you been to prison before? Now that might mean that prison is a very accurate reflection of risk. In other words, we send risky people to prison and guess what? We were right, they are risky. They keep doing things which make us send them back to prison. So you might say there's a certain logic at play there. But you might also say, wait a minute, we're sending people to prison, we're spending a lot of money. We're spending a lot of money. 70,000 euros per person. If you're a young person, probably over €250,000 is being spent on you, keeping you in custody for a year. Imagine, I've only got 70,000 euros in my back pocket. Is this the way I want to spend that money to solve that problem? So, in terms of a number of dimensions of success, we would certainly describe prisons as a failure. Now, the abolitionists are not just interested in effectiveness, there are also issues of human rights. That basically, this is simply unacceptable in a modern society. We can and should find better ways. Okay? But, let's begin with this concrete proposal. Does anyone think it's completely implausible? Is it shocking? Is it nonsense? Is it one of those things that you hear in a sociology lecture? Like, get it real.
I suppose it would depend if the crime was where somebody had stolen a packet of sweets and they had an addiction problem versus a woman who murdered somebody. They're two very different. So there your 100 places would come into place for the very serious crime. And maybe the minor crimes or those kind of things that are related to the other indicators, maybe then the money that has gone into or would go into keeping in prison could go into services to rehabilitate or to educate or to, so rather than kick the can down the road.
Okay. So it might come down to the nature of the offences. Well, and the reason why Pat Carlin uses this example is precisely because of that. It's precisely because women's imprisonment is maybe a good place to start about thinking about this. What do we know? First of all, it's quite a small proportion of the overall scale of imprisonment. Worldwide, give or take 5%. 5% of the world's prison population is female. What do we know as well? We know that for the more serious offences, the vast majority of people in prison will be males. We know that the primary offences for which females are imprisoned tend to be more minor crimes. Often thefts, often robberies, often things like shoplifting, often things like drug use, often things like possession of stolen goods, which might be passing stolen credit cards or phones or things like that. But we're not talking about serial killers. So one issue is, should there be a threshold that regardless of how many phones you have stolen, you should still never be sent to prison? Might we want to restrict it to serious violent offenders?
Yeah, it should be, because they're not sent them to the prison each time to smoke crack with the speed.
And yet remember, until the restrictions were placed on sending people to prison for fine default, the majority of the women who were sent to prison were there because they didn't pay a fine. And why was that fine imposed? Because the original offence they were charged with was not serious enough to send them to prison. So I would have thought dealing with the issue of fine default in itself is a huge improvement. Sorry, you were going to say something.
Yeah, the gender could make a difference as well, you know, in people accepting it, you know, because it is considered, there is a view that, you know, a judge will take into consideration if a woman has children at home already, you know, so there's already that kind of sense of, you know, the judge will look a bit deeper into something if a woman has children at home. So I think that would be a different statement if it was just, you know, as you were saying, if it's all offenders, male and female, you know, if that was the proposal.
Okay. Yeah. I want to hear from more, you know. How about that back row where all that wisdom, the wisdom that bubbles up and just drifts back to the back row? You people are gorging yourself on wisdom in the back row. Careful now, you might make a mistake and make eye contact while I look at you. Any observation? Is it stupid? Would you vote for someone who said something like that?
It's stupid. I think there is some sense to it. Like, completely around people. That's a bit too far. But starting off somewhere, I think that's a good place to start.
I think you're very right in that many people would feel eradicate prisons, but surely that's just silly. Whatever arguments we might have about the justification of them, the effectiveness of them, you know, there are dangerous people and we need to be protected from them. So I'd imagine that sentiment, as we mentioned, is probably kind of widely shared. But an interesting thing, if you accept this, that in effect, maybe there are people who are going to prison that don't need to be in prison, then in effect what it does is literally unlock a way to thinking about the question of not really who goes to prison, but who needs to be in prison. Who are the people that, left to their own devices, will bring misery and heartache and just horrible things upon those around them? And if that's a select group of people, does that mean that there are other people who don't meet those criteria that end up in prison? And what that also brings into question is the issue of relativism. Because in looking at the graphs we've seen over the last couple of weeks, what we've seen is that societies in prison, very different numbers of people In other words, they imprison at a very different rate. So, for example, the US imprisons currently at a rate 9 times that of Ireland. And even given the differences in population, the differences in numbers are still stark. Ireland has 3,800 people in custody. The US has 2.2 million. Every now and again you'll see a president, including Trump, pardoning people after they have been in prison for 14 years for minor drug offences. So, in that sense, while certainly the issue of abolishing prisons, and that's in a sense why abolitionists talk about it as an ideal rather than, you know, here's your pickaxe, get down to that prison wall and start knocking it down. I've never heard anyone say such a thing. But what they have said is, how might you think about reducing imprisonment? And one of the mirrors into that debate is to look at yourself, and then of course to look at other societies. Why do some imprison more, and why do some imprison less? So, thank you for the comments and observations, I appreciate it. We're going to park that. It's an interesting thing to think about, and I do encourage you to think about it. What's the right level of imprisonment? What's too high a level? What's too low a level? Because one thing to bear in mind is, you pay. If imprisonment doesn't work and it produces counterproductive consequences, you pay, we all pay. The costs of it, financially, you pay, we all pay. So, is this how you want your money to be spent? That's a question. I think a question we might want to ask about anything we engage with. Is this value for money? You ask that question when you buy a cup of coffee. Why wouldn't you ask it when you send someone to prison at the cost of 70,000 plus euros? Or 250 or 300,000 plus euros? Okay, so, one question to consider. Now, let's move on to talk a little bit about restorative justice. So, conflicts in society. Well, one issue is to consider that the criminal justice system tends to be structured around retribution. For all of the talk about reform, rehabilitation, deterrence, one thing we do know is that it does involve punishing people who have committed infractions. And we see it very much cast in terms of an adversarial system, that prosecution, and the defense, and so on. But the reality is that for all of that, the drama evoked by the notion of the public trial, oh, goodness, evidence, dramatic evidence suddenly being presented. Oh, I wasn't expecting that. The reality is that most people who go to a criminal court find the process tedious beyond belief. It is not characterized by excitement or drama or novelty by and large. Instead, by a certain drab and grey predictability. It is as if justice is a conveyor belt. If you ever go to a district court, you will see how many cases are stacked. Oh my goodness, in 2 hours, they're getting through 20 cases. Gosh, there's an awful lot of deliberation about justice going on in a short amount of time that each case gets. So, the reality is that justice operates not in the full glare of the public light, even though courts are generally public, apart from in some circumstances. But would you dream of popping into a court to see what happened? At one stage, I was a researcher working on a project about courts, the equivalent of district courts, but in Britain. My goodness. You think you'll be where justice is going to be delivered. And it was basically one person handing a bunch of papers to another and saying guilty or not guilty. That's pretty much what it was like. Were there crowds of interested members of the public gathered around to see justice being delivered? No, there weren't. The court might wonder, is there a probation officer there? And I would be the only person in the court, other than the solicitors. And they would look at me and would say, I'm sorry. Empty, draft, formulate. The formula. So, how is justice done? Well, Christie, in his very famous article, Topics is Poverty, and he presented it, by the way, as the opening lecture to announce the establishment of the Sheffield Centre for Criminological Research, I think it was called at the time. This was in 1976. And what do you do when you invite a famous guest speaker in? And you're all sitting down attentively. And now over to Professor Nils Christie, this really kind of radical criminologist. And he begins by saying what? Words to the effect that, I wonder, do we not have too many criminologists in the world? I wonder, do we not have too many criminology research centres in the world? Maybe instead of opening them, we should be closing them. Thanks, Nils. Thanks. What do we mean by that? He basically meant, if you gave some people too much expertise and credibility, maybe you were robbing justice from others. And he posed the question, who owns conflicts? I don't mean so that you can, buy it and sell it in the stock market. I mean, who owns it in the sense of having the right to be involved in it, having the right to decide the shape it takes and the outcome it delivers. He says the state, it claims ownership over the process. This is really part of sovereignty. What do states do? They control the legitimate means of coercion. Thank you, Max Weber. They also control the means of taxation, so that they can build courts where they can control coercion. But the state claims ownership. And if you take the law into your own hands, that phrase in itself makes us tremble. Oh my goodness, a vigilante, they've taken the law into their own hands. They shouldn't be doing that. That's why the state sets up a police and a prosecution service to prosecute on behalf of the public. So that's why when you see a court case, you never see the name of the victim versus the name of the offender. You see the Director of Public Prosecutions, DPP, versus Mulcahy. The state takes up this responsibility on behalf of the public. The Director of Public Prosecutions. Why? Because a social harm is being committed. The criminal crime is not just a personal harm, it's a social harm, and therefore the state claims the right to own these conflicts and to prosecute them. The professions, they claim ownership over the process. Someone is accused of a crime, and they stand up and they're about to, and their solicitor says, would you shut up? You're going to say something stupid, you're going to put your foot in it, and they might. But in effect, what you see is the person who decides, often, is the person, whether they put their foot in it or not, is the solicitor. I'll be the one to decide if what you say is the right thing or the wrong thing. We get the offender. You've been accused of a crime. I'll take the fifth. I don't want to talk about it. You mean you don't want to put yourself forward for cross-examination? Yeah. And in a way, what that can do is actually shield offenders from accepting responsibility for the crime. You made someone cry. Why would you do such a thing? I mean, imagine being forced to confront that question. What kind of person are you? I'm a tough man. I go to the gym. I got tattoos. I've got a gun. I'm a tough guy. I'm sure you are. But what else are you? Are you just a big bully? Is that what you are? I'm a tough guy. Get away from me. I'm a tough guy. And sometimes machismo and this kind of violent masculinity can be a way of keep back, keep back. So in a sense, sometimes we never get to find out, why would you do such an appalling thing? Why would you do such an appalling thing? That question which really might be at the forefront of victims' minds, might never be fully answered. And as for the victim, the system that the person, that the whole system is set up to protect, you would imagine, above all, they tend to be extremely marginal within the process. Now this is changing. We have such things as victim impact statements, where people can actually recount the impact that an offence has had on them, their family, their peace of mind. They get a chance to state the impact it has had. But the irony, of course, is that this came very late in the day. The victims' movement, which you would imagine would underpin everything, really came late in the day as far as the criminal justice system was concerned. So what do we see? We often see a system whereby punishment takes the form of denunciation. You are a monster. You have done something awful. And what we see is what Garfinkel described as a status degradation ceremony. Equivalent to when a teacher drags you out by the ear from your class and hauls you up in front of everyone and says, "You stupid, stupid person." In other words, publicly denouncing someone. And often what this does is give rise to a rethinking of someone's entire character. Suddenly they become the person, oh my goodness, that they always were. So you interpret their past in light of what they've done now. Suddenly they adopt a whole new identity, what Becker called a master status. Oh, have you met Aegon, the murderer? Sorry, don't you mean Aegon, the sociologist? No, Aegon, the murderer. The idea that the criminal identity supersedes everything else. Everything becomes read through the prism of the crime, of the offense. And so this involves often making people martyrs. Right? And sometimes we see it. This is in Maricopa County in Phoenix, in Arizona. Sheriff Arpaio, quite a controversial figure. One of his ways of, in effect, denigrating criminals was to make them wear pink. I'm a tough man. I've got tattoos. I've killed people. But on this pink jumpsuit.